Good afternoon. Welcome to those of you who joined us at our earlier sessions today. Welcome back. And for those of you I see who are new to the seminar today, thank you for joining us. This is our final session of our virtual in-house counsel seminar titled Game Over: How Cancel Culture Affects Corporate Counsel. Again, I'm Jen Ritter-Tomasic, Marketing Coordinator of Events and Proposals at Ward & Smith, and I'll be the MC for this session. Before we begin this session, I do have a few housekeeping items. We are going to utilize PowerPoint slides during the webinar, and we think it will be helpful for you to be able to see both our videos and slides at the same time. To do this, you may need to make one adjustment to your view settings. Find the View Options button at the top or bottom of your screen and click on it to see your options. Then choose side-by-side mode. The slide deck will appear on the left and our videos should appear on the right. You can then slide the separator to the left or the right to adjust the size of each view. If you have any questions with video or sound quality during the presentation, please reach out via the Zoom chat feature and I'll try to troubleshoot with you. During this session, you will have opportunities to answer questions via our polling software. Please note, if you attended either or both of our earlier sessions and participated in these polling questions, you do not need to opt in again. If you did not attend any of the previous sessions, opting in to participate is easy. Take out your mobile phone and text the message in-house counsel to the number 22333. So you want to open up a new text message, type the number 22333 where you would enter the phone number, and then the message in-house counsel, no spaces, no hyphen, and hit send, and that will opt you into the polling software. If you do have any questions for our panelists during this session, please type your question in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer them live. So let's get started with speaker introductions. Today's panelists are Angela Dowdy, Xavier Lightfoot, Erica Rogers, and Haley Wells. Angela is a North Carolina State Bar Board Specialist in Trademark Law and Certified Information Privacy Professional for the United States. She also serves as the firm's Director of Legal Process Management. Angela oversees several initiatives to optimize and increase the efficiency of the firm's legal services. In addition to adopting and executing practices such as Legal Lean Sigma, Angela is responsible for moving the firm through the implementation of process improvement, design methodologies, and innovative technology. Xavier's practice focuses on a wide range of labor and employment law issues, including personnel policies and handbooks, background checks, employment discrimination and harassment, employee discipline and termination, drug and alcohol testing, and various wage and hour matters. Additionally, he assists in the construction practice section with civil litigation surrounding contractor or subcontractor disputes. Erica assists individuals, small businesses, and large corporations with a wide array of intellectual property matters. Her practice focuses on trademark selection and clearance, trademark prosecution and registration, and trademark portfolio management. She also routinely engages in resolving trademark disputes, including drafting cease and desist letters, negotiating coexistence agreements, providing subject matter expertise for litigation and federal court, and handling cases before the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board. Also presenting today is Haley Wells. Haley's practice primarily focuses on alcoholic beverage law, labor and employment law, and civil litigation. In her labor and employment practice, Haley regularly advises individual and corporate clients in matters of covenants not to compete, employment discrimination, discipline and termination, harassment, wrongful discharge, wage and hour matters, personnel policies and procedures, and preparation of employee handbooks and employment agreements. Again, thank you all for joining us. Angela will be moderating this panel, and I'll turn the mic over to her.
Hi, good afternoon. So we'll jump right in. We're going to talk about cancel culture and how this is affecting in-house counsel in the way that they advise their business units, their marketing divisions, and even move through some brand transitions. So what is cancel culture? And there are a lot of definitions out there. But the one that we thought that was most applicable to businesses is it really is a form of boycott in which the called out person or organization is really thrust out of the social or professional circles that they are currently in. It can be on social media. Sometimes it's in the real world. It's most likely going to be in both, but they are said to be canceled. And it's really the most modern form of ostracism. It feels new, I think, because of the level that it can reach, but it's been around for generations. We got historical examples such as the Salem witch trials, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. It's really the shaming of those whose views or actions differ from our own. Social media has provided this new, wider reaching avenues for calling out objectable behavior. And the cancel culture we found has really infiltrated every level of society, which is really why it's hitting from an employment perspective, from a branding perspective, from a financial perspective. For example, celebrities. Kanye West was one of the first to tweet about his own fear that his support of President Trump would have him, quote, canceled. Both President Obama and President Trump have addressed the, quote, canceling or the, quote, call out culture within their speeches. Businesses are affected on a regular basis. Organizations are forced to go on the defensive and make difficult decisions about employee behavior, about social movement involvement, decisions about hiring, firing, brand names and images, and the overall reaction to any social movement that's occurring in the world. And these social movements themselves, such as the Me Too movement, has had a large effect on society's trend towards cancel culture and this wider acceptance of public shaming. And the pandemic itself, we're all very isolated and our lives are very much tied to the internet now more than ever. It's where we're getting all of our information. And so the results have been an amplification of these dynamics that have historically always existed, but we're now all getting pulled in across the world into one large public shaming. And it's created a very interesting debate. The debate is whether the cancel culture is really working. You know, is it really creating accountability? Or on the other hand, is it resulting in a restriction of free speech? In an open letter to Harper's Magazine, some authors decided to voice their opinion against the concept of cancel culture on the basis that it restricts the free exchange of information, that it, quote, cancels the culture of, quote, cancel culture is an intolerance of the exchanging of opposed views. And interestingly enough, the immediate reaction was backlash. And the backlash was, you know, you that wrote this letter, you only don't like it because you're already in a position of power. And so it was almost like an attempt to immediately crush that opposing view. And the basis was, you know, you're already in power, we're not. And so cancel culture is our way of holding you accountable because we don't have any other way besides the social reaction to do so. So cancel culture has really evolved from a long-standing historical behavior. And so what we're going to focus on today is what can organizations and employers do when they're faced with these cancel culture issues. But before we get started with the panel, we did want to ask a question of you. Do you think free speech is under threat from cancel culture? And so this is where, yeah, you can use your polling from your mobile device. Interesting. Most people, it seems to be a pretty clear lead that yes, free speech is under threat. We were actually, before we got started, let's get a little closer. How much in preparing, all the panelists and I were talking, and in preparing for this, we all agreed that our thoughts on cancel culture has really evolved when you start looking at all sides and all issues. But there was definitely a bend towards, while, you know, yes, in certain situations, as we always have in society, we should be able to call people out when their behavior is not acceptable. But there was clearly a consensus among all of us that there is a fear underlying that in which people don't have all the facts, in which there is long-term reaction to both employers and individuals. So it seems like we're all on the same thought for that. So let's start with two real-world examples of companies having to address cancel culture issues arising from the employee's behavior. And then Haley and Xavier are going to talk about what the process for which employers can, one, respond, and two, better position themselves to proactively avoid being the target of cancel culture, especially in response to an employee's behavior. So unfortunately, organizations get pulled in whether the employee is acting within their role, position, and responsibilities or not. So the first example is on May 25th this year, there was an incident between Amy Cooper, who was a white woman walking her dog, and Christian Cooper, who is not related, a black bird watcher in Central Park. Amy Cooper's dog was unleashed in an area where leashing is required, and Christian requested that she put her dog on the leash. Amy refused, and the exchange escalated to the point where Amy was screaming, raised voice, and Christian made the decision to record the incident. Amy in turn demanded he stop recording and threatened to call the police if he didn't stop recording, with the threat that she was going to tell the police, quote, "There's an African-American man threatening my life." Christian didn't stop recording, and Amy in turn did call the police, and she called 911 and claimed that her life and the life of her dog was being threatened. So Christian was recording this entire incident. Following the incident, Christian and Christian's sister posted the video on Twitter and Facebook, and it immediately went viral. The cancel culture consequences for Amy were swift and severe. She lost her position as the head of Franklin Templeton's insurance investment division. She was required to return the dog appearing in the video to the adoption shelter. The New York City Commission of Human Rights launched an investigation into Amy. Central Park requested she be banned from coming back, and the Manhattan District Attorney charged her with filing a false police report. The fact that Amy was not merely ridiculed for her actions, but actually lost her job among all these other repercussions is what distinguishes cancel culture that we're talking about today from the mere public shaming that we have historically seen. But most importantly, Amy's employer, Franklin Templeton, had to respond very quickly. And the way in which it responded was likely the largest factor for that employer as to whether it too would be pulled into that cancel culture event. Franklin Templeton issued several statements regarding its zero tolerance policy for racism following the video going viral, and terminated Amy within 24 hours of the event. And just thinking in terms of, especially larger organizations, the fact that a whole investigation and decision of termination in somebody that was very high happened within 24 hours it's pretty shocking, but I think it's how they had to respond. The second event is a little different in terms of it happened within the employee's role, position, and responsibilities. In August of this year, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company landed in the spotlight for one of its policies that prohibits politically affiliated slogans and material, but does not contain a similar prohibition on racial justice or equality issues. And one of their employees took to social media anonymously to complain that while he couldn't wear a MAGA hat to work, another employee could wear a Black Lives Matter shirt. The issue was amplified when President Trump tweeted that Goodyear tires had, quote, banned MAGA hats, and that people in response should not buy Goodyear tires. Again, the cancel culture consequences were immediate. Sales dropped and stock prices dipped within hours. In this case, Goodyear stood its ground. It responded by disputing the misconception that its policy is a, quote, ban on MAGA, and refocused the message that its policy requires employees to, quote, refrain from workplace expressions in support of political campaigning for any candidate or political party. Goodyear invested a substantial time and resources to communicate that its policy is equally prohibitive on all political messages, Republican and Democrat, but that it is intentionally supportive of all efforts for racial justice and equality in order to further its culture of diversity and inclusion. So this is a completely different reaction than what Franklin Templeton had. Now, the facts to these events are substantially different, but really the point and what Haley and Xavier are going to talk about is how quickly and how much time, energy, and effort these businesses had to invest just to deal with this cancel culture that had absolutely nothing to do with them. So we'll start with Haley. Haley, what would be your advice to help organizations be in the best position to deal with these types of scenarios or events? And what can organizations do or not do when restricting employee behavior?
Thanks, Angela. I'm going to take the second question first because I think it kind of informs our approach to answering the first question. When we think about the concept of cancel culture and what an employer can and can't do when it finds itself in this type of situation, I think we have to start kind of from the top when we're doing our decision tree. And when we look at these types of issues, it's important to keep in mind that for the most part, employees in the private sector workplace don't have any First Amendment protections to free speech, and an employer can discipline and take action against an employee because of some comments that they make, whether they be in the workplace or online. What the analysis really turns on is what should an employer do? And that really is going to be fact specific, and it's going to be driven by the context in which the comments were made. Important legal safeguards that can kind of serve as the guardrails really for this decision-making process are sound employment policies. I don't think I have to tell anyone who's joined our call today how important those can be when confronted with these types of issues, but examples of these types of policies that your company needs to have and needs to update regularly and needs to use really to guide this decision-making process would, of course, be a social media policy. In addition to having that social media policy, there needs to be training on the topic of social media and what is and is not appropriate. With that in mind, an employer can terminate an employee for a social media post or for some other form of speech that the employee may make or may engage in if it amounts to harassment, if it amounts to discrimination against a protected class of individuals, if it would create a hostile work environment or could be interpreted as creating a hostile work environment. An employer can terminate an employee for social media posts that damages the company's reputation, that damages the company's clients or customers, or the community at large. And finally, an employer can terminate an employee for speech that threatens the health or safety of the company's workforce. And so, you know, I think as an employer is wrestling with these types of decisions or is facing a cancel culture type scenario, it's important to know that the employer does hold a lot of the power, but that doesn't always guide the employer in what it should do. You know, what do we do, what should we do is really going to be guided by the facts of the situation. Is it a very egregious situation like the Ms. Cooper situation in Central Park, where the employer feels like it has no choice but to take drastic action so as to communicate not only to its employees that this type of conduct is not going to be permitted in the workplace, but to also communicate to its customers and to its client base that this is inconsistent with what we find to be acceptable as an organization? Or is it able to take a more measured approach and to take the time to try to educate the public as to why their perception of what has happened is incorrect? And so, you know, I think all of those are important considerations that you know, have to be accounted for when the organization is deciding how to respond. The final point that I'll mention from a legal perspective with respect to what can an employer do and what should an employer do is there are a couple of asterisks to this notion of an employer can discipline an employee for their comments or for their speech. The first is that an employer cannot do anything that would be perceived as interfering with the employee's right to engage in concerted activity, or would be perceived as being a violation of the National Labor Relations Act. And so that's an important limitation on an employer's ability to respond to online conduct. And the other is, it's kind of what I would call a developing area, and that is the notion that states that have a law that prohibits an employer from taking disciplinary action against an employee for their lawful use of lawful products outside the workplace, could that type of law be applied to this type of scenario? There have not been any legal challenges that we were able to find that have been that have been presented in other states, because a number of states have that type of law that North Carolina also has. But it is a possible avenue that an employee who may find themselves to be in the spotlight over a cancel culture event, it's a possible legal avenue that they would have to challenge the ultimate sanction that an employer may try to impose, and that is, either some drastic discipline or some termination. And so I just mentioned that so that the participants who are on the line keep that in mind. That there is this statute out there that could be used as a possible defense by an employee. Xavier, anything to add?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Haley, and I'll just add here briefly, many businesses and organizations, they spend a significant amount of time and money to establish and build their brands. How employees choose to conduct themselves or express their viewpoints on social media can potentially have a negative impact to the employee's employer. And truthfully, as an organization or an employer, you cannot directly control what your employees choose to post on social media. But as Haley mentioned, there are measures that your organization can and should take to promote good social media behavior from your workforce, and how to handle those situations when you have an employee who exhibits bad social media behavior. Now, the first thing, as Haley mentioned, was you want to have a good, carefully crafted social media policy. And you also want to have training to go along with that. How often you conduct that training will depend on your organization and your business needs, but you cannot go wrong with doing it annually. Most of us would like to think that we know the do's and don'ts of social media, and it's pretty self-explanatory. However, it seems like we see in the news every other week a new headline where we see an employee getting dinged and potentially damaging their employer's reputation because they've got an employee who has posted something offensive or inappropriate on social media. So as an employer, as an organization, you want to think about how to make that training impactful and effective for your organization. Keep in mind that the training should go beyond just merely educating employees on the social media policy. There's a few things you can do to achieve this. For instance, number one, find ways to tie your mission and your organizational objectives back to your social media policy, and make sure that you're communicating that to your employees. The second thing that you want to do is make sure that social media is a part of your company culture by encouraging your employees to share organizational successes, assuming that that makes sense for your workforce and for your business. The final thing that you can do is making sure that your employees clearly know what the consequences are for hate speech, violent threats, or any other harassing online behavior, and how such conduct can negatively impact the organization. Those are the practical strategies for your organization to consider on the front end in order for you to promote good social media behavior.
Thank you. Well, Erica, what about from a branding? As Xavier mentioned, this isn't just a HR issue. This very much becomes a, your employer represents you and your brand. What are your thoughts on disclaimers or ways in which, from a brand perspective, employers can handle cancel culture?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Angela. I think it's a good thought as a solution for social media to just tell your employees to put a disclaimer. And sometimes disclaimers are effective for social media. So for instance, for lawyers disclaiming that their posts are not legal advice. I mean, maybe that has some, effective results, but when it comes to trying to shield your company from the comments of your employees, I don't think a disclaimer is, and it's not effective on social media for two reasons. So first, adding a disclaimer to your social media is actually reminding the audience of your employment, whether you intended that or not. If you're saying, my posts have nothing to do with the company that I work for, then you're really targeting the company in a way that consumers will be reminded where you work. And whether you want them to not make that association or not, it's really in the hands of consumers to make that association, and they will. If you say something offensive, I'm sure if your employer's at the top of your social media page, and it's something that they will make that association even if you don't want them to. And the second reason is that social media users are way more sophisticated than we might expect them to be. So regardless of any disclaimer, whether you have it or not, it's pretty easy to figure out where somebody is working and what companies they might be associated with. Since we see that consumers are scrutinizing comments on the internet and responding with their purchasing power, a disclaimer is really not enough, in our opinion, to defend against that. So when it comes down to it, because of the power of a brand and what consumers associate that brand with, it's really not about what employees say on the internet, it's what the audience hears. And so I don't think a disclaimer is enough. And all of that to say, my personal opinions are my own and not that of my employer.
Okay. And I would agree. I have to admit, Eric and I work closely together, and there are not truer words that it does not matter what you say. It only matters what they hear when it comes to branding messages. Well, let's roll to another polling question. Do you guys think that cancel culture is effective in combating the sexism, the racism, or the other wrongdoings to which are being, objectified in the world? Does it truly hold people accountable for their actions? Looks like overwhelmingly people say yes, it does hold people accountable. As an attorney, and y'all can all appreciate, I'd split the hair of, you can hold somebody accountable, but does it appropriately combat, or does it have a chilling effect? Would be a whole different question. So I know it's splitting hairs, but we would all agree, as we were speaking earlier with you guys, and that, yeah, it does hold people accountable, whether they needed to be held accountable or not. It's certainly having an effect, but the effectiveness in combating is always the interesting part. So let's look at some strategies and that other organizations have employed in response to avoid being, quote, canceled when they were the target of the cancel culture. So the first one I'll set up, and it's one that's well known, and the response strategy from a legal perspective, both from labor and employment, HR, and branding, was actually, I would think, phenomenal. It's one of the best that I've seen, and that's the Starbucks. So at Starbucks, there was a manager that asked two Black men sitting at a table to leave the cafe since they weren't buying anything. The men responded that they were waiting for a friend, and so they did not leave. The manager of Starbucks then called the police, and the police came in, and they didn't just get the men escorted out, they were actually arrested. And the backlash, again, was immediate. Everybody was recording what happened. And Starbucks knew that its response was going to be crucial to its surviving and the avoidance of being canceled. So what did Starbucks do that we thought was really positive? First and foremost, especially from a branding perspective, took immediate responsibility. And the apology was issued from the top down. They did not try to blame it on anybody else. They didn't call in the manager and just say she wasn't following policy. Starbucks owned it. And then they went on an immediate campaign to address the underlying issues that they felt created the problem, created the event. So instead of just focusing on the event itself, they took a root cause analysis and what they wanted Starbucks to represent and how they could improve their organization for employees and for their brand. So in the end, they went on this campaign of training. And like Xavier said earlier, their training is pretty rigorous and regular and varies based on whether you're a manager or regional owner, those types of things. But it also did it on an outwardly basis, like in a very trying to think. I thought about it earlier, but how it made me feel. It's not really a good word to say other than how it made me feel in terms of Starbucks's response. And so we thought that was a good example on a branding perspective of saving themselves. And so I want to start with Erica this time, since it was such a big brand issue for Starbucks. What advice would you give for companies that are the target of cancel culture when responding from their marketing perspective?
Yeah, sure. And just to sort of lay the foundation for this, it might be helpful to just talk about first, what a brand is and how it functions and how it derives its value. So a trademark, like the ones on the slide now, indicates to consumers the origin of the goods and services and allows consumers to distinguish between goods and services. And it derives its value from the quality of the goods and services, but also from the reputation and the goodwill associated with the company. And so these logos or these symbols, these brands have a lot of power, and they have power because of what consumers think of the goods and services that are offered when they see these logos. And so to answer Angela's question, I mean, since we know that the hands and the powers and consumers, then you really have to think about what you want to communicate to consumers. And that not just being a response to cancel culture, that doesn't necessarily have to be, how you respond, but also preempting that and talk about ways that you can make a positive spin and a positive stance to consumers using the reputation that you have. So it's both about acknowledging and taking responsibility if something like this were to happen, like the way that Starbucks did, but also if consumers are expecting a certain ethical stance tied to the brands that they love, being ahead of what a single employee might say, or a single instance, being ahead of that and taking a positive spin and doing that. I mean, there are ways that you can do that in a neutral way. So an example of that I wanted to share today was Time Magazine with the election. So Time has such a powerful brand that they were able, for the first time since their first publication in 100 years, they were able to change their brand, but still consumers know that it's Time Magazine. So for the first time, I hope it's working. I guess because of my background, it's not working, but they changed the cover of their magazine to say vote. And so sorry that you can't see that, but it's easy to look up. It's the November issue. And so this is what brands are doing, that they can take responsibility, but also be ahead of it and show to consumers not necessarily a one side of issues, but just in a neutral way that they care about issues and that, that they're caring about the integrity associated with their brand.
Well said. Well, we have a question from one of our attendees, and it actually ties well into the question that I was going to ask of Haley and Xavier. But let's start with the question. The question will actually be for both labor and employment and from a branding perspective. Have you seen whether a company's social media policy, for example, publishing an employee handbook and setting out clear expectations for an employee's use of social media, both personal and as part of a business message, helps prevent or mitigate a company's exposure to cancel culture? That is, could that policy protect the company's branding and marketing position? So we can take it twofold. So I'll start with you, Haley. Have you seen that including very specific guidelines around the use of social media, both for personal reasons and business reasons, helps mitigate exposure, or at least gives a better positioning for a company?
I think it can definitely limit exposure to the extent you take the steps that Xavier walked us through, and that is you've got to train your workforce on the social media policy so that they're aware of it. If it's just sitting in your employee handbook and it's not talked about and it's not front of mind for your employees as they're using social media, I'm not sure that it has much impact on heading off these types of events.
So Erica, what about from a branding or a marketing perspective? Do you think that having these types of policies in place for companies to be able to use when responding to this from a brand position helps?
Yeah, I think it's more of a PR issue than branding, in the sense that if you have these policies in place and you are finding ways to quickly take responsibility and accountability in the little amount of time that you have, having a policy that you can show existed, that preceded the time of the incident, having that you can show is really going to help the overall messaging and the overall branding, because it's not something that's reactive, but something that you could show existed before. So I do think it makes a difference from a brand perspective. And we saw that with Goodyear, with the example where their immediate response was showing their policy language. Like, listen, this is a policy that we have. We're not taking a stance on any certain political side. We're just saying we don't want these, we don't want employees to wear any political messaging hats. So it's definitely something that helps. I don't think it cures it, but it's definitely something that helps.
Xavier, what advice would you give a company that becomes a target of cancel culture? So Erica talked about some of the things that the brand can do to position itself. What would you tell, especially for in-house counsel that's probably going to immediately get pulled in, game plan for responding in a way that, of course, keeps them on stable ground for labor and employment laws, but they got to react somehow?
Absolutely. And thank you for the question, Angela. It all comes down to, one, what was done, and two, who did it. And let's take the latter first. Was this a situation where your organization became a target of cancel culture because of something your employee did on social media or out and about in the public, exhibiting poor behavior and conduct? Or is this a situation where it's at the organizational level, where you all as an organization have done something to potentially offend the greater public? And so the response you take is going to be different depending on, who did the action that made you the target, and exactly what you did. It may be something where you have to figure out, is this a situation where we need to speak out and take a full front approach and have a strong response regarding the conduct? Or is this something where, it may potentially blow over if we give it some time, and it doesn't rise to the level where you feel like your customer base is going to turn against your organization if you do not take some type of response. So the key in all this is to make sure you have some type of plan in place, whether it is something that your employees do or something that your organization does. If it's the employee, sometimes it may be a situation where they post something that is not on the optics side, it doesn't look good, but it is not necessarily violating any type of social employment policy you have, or such as your anti-harassment policies or your social media policy. But it just doesn't look good optics wise, right? So from that standpoint, you potentially may not take any type of action in the form of terminating that employee, but you may have a conversation with that employee via the HR director and or supervisor in discussing the behavior. And you may decide to, we want to get in front of this and we want to distance ourselves from that employee's viewpoint and say, this is what our company stands for, and going back to your missions and your organizational objectives. So it's important to keep that in mind, because this is very fact intensive, and it's a case by case type thing. And you don't want to put yourself in a position where you've got the immediate backlash and you take a hasty step, and it's not completely thought out, or an investigation is not done to figure out whether or not you need to take that full front approach. So you definitely want to be careful when you decide to respond, but you do need to take some type of action, and that's going to depend on what exactly is done and who's doing it. Haley, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only point that I would make, Xavier, is, there's a lot of space between the do nothing approach and canceling someone over some discrete event. And I think, as organizational leaders, that's where your leadership comes in, and where you lend value, where you can say, hey, this conduct is not reflective of what we as an organization wish to portray. And so we're going to use this as an opportunity to do some educating and to remind everyone about our policies and why they exist and what is okay. And so, I think that this discussion is helpful in reminding us that it's not, do nothing or terminate the employee. There's a lot of space in between, and a lot of other options that are available if you are confronted with this type of scenario.
So Haley, in talking about the places in between, I know that you had some great examples of different ways that companies had responded. And so I was going to ask you to just mention, or talk about the approach of Trader Joe had an approach, Boogaloo had a different approach. We've already talked about Starbucks. So talk to us about those and how those companies handled the situation.
Sure. I mean, in looking through these examples, I have to say, I think Starbucks definitely set the gold standard as far as how you take a very negative event and turn it into a positive. They used it as an opportunity to shut down all of their retail stores, to retrain their workforce, and they were very transparent about that. And they were very open with their customer base about, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it, because this is not consistent with what we as an organization believe in and stand for. Trader Joe's, has kind of taken a different approach. They've come under some scrutiny, I would say, over the last few years, but of course more recently, as cancel culture has kind of gotten some legs, about some of their brands. For their Latin American line of food, they refer to those products under the Trader Jose brand. For the Asian brand of foods, they refer to those as Trader Ming. For the Italian brand of foods, they refer to those as Trader Giotto. And they've taken some criticism over that decision, and they frankly have dug in and said, we're not going to change. It's not meant to be discriminatory. It's not meant to be offensive. And as the pressure started to mount and more articles were run calling out Trader Joe's, and people, there was a rising tide of people saying you must change, they sort of pivoted and said, we're not caving to the pressure, but these were kind of sublines that we were planning on phasing out anyway as we updated our logo and our branding. And so, I think over the next 6 to 9 months, most of those products will still exist, but they won't have those more regional or ethnic type labels that many people found offensive and inappropriate. And then the final example that we've got up here is from a brewery in Western North Carolina. They released a beer called Boogaloo, and there was almost immediately within the community a public outcry over the selection of this name and the label. And many, quickly pointed out that this was a term that had been adopted by the alt-right, and it was associated with race wars. And the Currahee Brewing Company, quickly issued a statement and said, that's not what we intended. It's not what we meant. We had no idea that that was an offensive term. And that frankly wasn't enough. They were publicly shamed. They were excommunicated from the Asheville Brewers Alliance, and their membership was revoked, which is the brewing membership organization in the western part of the state. And I thought the company, rather than just kind of letting things die there and just being stuck with the negative publicity, did probably the only thing that they could do in the circumstance, and that is they committed to donating the profits from the sale of this product, which was already out in the market, to support causes that were basically anti-alt-right, and that is that they support racial minorities and those who may be the target of the organizations that have adopted the Boogaloo term. So I think just interesting to see how different companies have used these high-profile instances to either implement training within the organization and to use them as ways to communicate with their customer base about how far they want to distance themselves from some of the negative publicity that's being thrown their way.
So it seems that when it comes to cancel culture, the intent mostly doesn't matter. What we're really learning is, it doesn't appear to be enough to claim that nothing racist or discriminatory was meant by a comment, a product, a posting, an employee's behavior, and that the response and redress is really what matters. But let's also talk about when redress beyond training and apologies and monetary donations is not enough. Let's talk about how organizations are handling brand selection and transitions to avoid or react to cancel culture. The organizations or the brands on this slide were all targets of the cancel culture accountability aimed at its brand itself. So not a policy of the company, not behavior of any particular employee, but specifically what the brand itself communicated, even without words. So each of these brands, from a legal perspective, met all of the legal brand registration and protection, but they've also experienced the strong effect of the cancel culture holding them accountable, and they all approached it in a little bit of a different way. And so I'm going to ask Erica to speak both on these examples of what happened, but more importantly, Erica, what advice would you give companies when it comes to, first of all, just selecting a brand, especially under these new society expectations, and then also how to best react when they're demanding that maybe your core brand be changed?
Thanks, Angela. And I know we're running low on time. I could talk an hour about this, so I'm going to try to select what I talk about and maybe what's the most productive. And maybe to start with that, I'd like to talk about the Redskins just quickly. Trademark attorneys could talk about this forever because it's really fascinating what happened in the history of the case law. But just quickly, so prior to 2017, there actually was a statutory basis to refuse registration for trademarks that are disparaging. And prior to 2019, there was the same sort of basis that refuses registration for trademarks that are offensive or scandalous. And we had cases being put forth time and time again, and then got all the way up to the Supreme Court on the basis of First Amendment rights to say, no, you should register my trademark. I don't care if it's disparaging, offensive, or scandalous. That's not your job, trademark office. That's not the government's job to make that decision. And so with these cases, we found that those provisions of the Lanham Act were found unconstitutional on First Amendment basis. So we have all of this push from plaintiffs in up until 2017, 2019 to say, trademark office, register my brand. We have this history of the Redskins where their registrations were canceled because they were disparaging, and they reapplied, so they since have them. But all of this on the other side of the fence, where Now, technically, you can register trademarks with the trademark office that are offensive, scandalous, disparaging. But after all of that push, we have this pressure from the other direction that doesn't really matter what the USPTO says or whether you can register it or not, because consumers have the power, and consumers say that you can't have brands that are offensive, scandalous, disparaging. We won't have it. We have the power to buy your services, your products, and we're not going to do it if they are this. So it's sort of really, I think it's interesting from that perspective, from the background, that we have this fight still, and that's how we started this panel between the First Amendment and cancel culture and pushing back on this. And so with all of that to say, I mean, Angela's right, the ones on the slide are brands that have changed. I don't necessarily think I should go through each one, but you can look them up and see how they've changed for being either disparaging or racist or perpetuating stereotypes. But the advice that I would give, I mean, anytime that you rebrand or you select a trademark, you should go through a search process, making sure that the trademark first is available, that there won't be infringement issues, but also making sure that the trademark or the brand is not going to offend, is not going to be a disparaging mark. And in order to do that, I think what we need to really realize is that relies on the opinion of more than just one person. You need a diverse group. So amplifying diversity in your marketing team, amplifying diversity at your, at your company, because we need these opinions both from internal and external perspectives to make sure that, if you really want to take a stance and show that you care about diversity in your brand, you should also do that at the table of the people that are deciding on what your brand or rebrand should be. So that's that.
Well, on the flip side, from an employment, so changing your brand or not changing your brand speaks volumes, as does publicly firing an employee. And so my question to Haley and Xavier is, what are the pros and cons of publicly firing an employee that has caused you to be the target of cancel culture?
Thanks, Angela. And I'll speak to this one quickly as well, since we're short on time. The pros, obviously it sends a powerful and public message to your customer base. It also sends a powerful message to your employees, and that is, we don't tolerate this, and this is, this activity or this comment conflicts with our company culture and is not one that we're going to tolerate. From a legal basis, I think you have to be, from a legal basis, you have to be concerned about, are you setting a precedent? Is it one that you're going to be stuck with, and you're going to have to get rid of other employees because, you may face some kind of allegation that you've treated someone disparately in terminating their employment, but not terminating another employee's employment. And so, it's a fine line to walk. It feels good to, feel like you've taken the spotlight off of the company by being able to point to a public termination and say, haha, we've got this person out of the organization. That's not who we are as a company. But, do be mindful of the fact that it could be something that is going to guide future employment decisions or create potential exposure when you treat someone differently and don't remove them from the organization.
All right. So what we really wanted to hear from you guys at this point is, are there any brands that you've stopped supporting because of cancel culture? And if so, type in the brand. So this one isn't a multiple choice. We'd like you to actually type in the company. So if none, Aunt Jemima, Woody Allen, Hobby Lobby. CNN, Goya. So clearly it's having an effect. If people have something to respond to, it's certainly having an impact. Bill Cosby, Hobby Lobby by far seems to be the top. Home Depot. Sorry, I'm trying to read them and they're all screwed up. But okay, well, I guess it really, the point is that it is having an effect even on, working professionals, not just, your younger generation that's tied to their phone and not making informed decisions. So what does this mean for organizations? According to a study that was in Forbes magazine, the message is very confusing. It says 64% of consumers around the world will buy or boycott a brand solely because of a position on a social or political issue. But at the same time, 56% of consumers believe that too many brands use societal issues as a marketing ploy and that they shouldn't be involved in these types of social movements. And so, it's very difficult, and everything we've talked about today is very difficult for businesses to make decisions because it's one of those, do you react, do you not react? Your reaction or non-reaction could result in dip in stock prices, less sales, the morale of your company. And so these are very difficult decisions. And so we recognize that. And then we also wanted to end on the note that at the end of the day, it's terrible, but 64% versus 56%, you just have to each individually as your company know who your consumers are, who you're communicating with, what you want your culture of your company to be, and what message that sends to both your employees and those that are going to buy your products. And we are a little short on time, but we did want to go around I wanted everybody in the panel to be able to at least give us an example of if they've ever changed their buying habits because of any particular incident of cancel culture. And so I'll start with Xavier.
Thanks for the question, Angela. Yeah, I have. I remember when Papa John's had the situation where their former CEO and chairman, John Schnatter, used a racial epithet on a conference call, and that was published out to the media and to the public. And I believe the response initially was kind of slow. And then the CEO, he ended up stepping down, but he was still involved in the company to a certain degree. But they finally got him out of the company. And then what you saw Papa John's take a more stronger response to that. They ended up adding Shaquille O'Neal onto their board. And when that happened, I was like, well, I love Shaq. And it seems like the company is doing a little bit more to kind of change their position in response to that. And I mean, I love Papa John. So at that point in time, I felt good about going back and patroning their business. But yeah, there's certainly been situations where I personally changed my buying habits as a result of cancel culture.
Thanks, Xavier. And I think that, applies to all of us. There are certain brands that I personally view differently as a result of the cancel culture stories that have come out against them. And some were a part of my buying habits and others weren't part of my buying habits. And I have to admit, in some cases, I have continued to purchase those products. And in other cases, I have made the decision not to, or I have made myself feel better by continuing to be a patron of certain organizations, but then support efforts that would be counter to the particular stances that I didn't like of that organization. And I think that's just a perfect example of how complex human feelings are, and that cancel culture at the end of the day has everything to do with people's feelings and how we respond to them and how we make people feel, whether it's your brand, whether it's your employee morale, and the message that you're sending to your consumers. So thanks everybody for being on the panel. We've had a great time today, and I had an awesome time getting to know you guys better and better understanding the cancel culture.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you so much to you and Haley, Xavier, and Erica for presenting today. For those of you in attendance following the webinar, we will send you an email. It will contain the recording of today's session. I also mentioned this in previous sessions, but I'll mention it for those who did not attend. I was in contact with the North Carolina State Bar Board of Continuing Legal Education earlier this week, and due to the pandemic, their review process has been slowed a bit. So because of this, our pre-approval forms for these sessions are still awaiting review. However, upon confirmation of our program approval from the bar, I will submit all of our accreditation materials for attendees seeking North Carolina CLE credit only. If you need out-of-state CLE, please email rsvp@wardensmith.com to receive a certificate of attendance and webinar materials for submission. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. We so appreciate you all joining us for our first ever virtual in-house counsel seminar. We're hopeful that in 2021, we can meet again in person at the Umstead. Until then, have a wonderful new year. This concludes our final session of our in-house counsel seminar and our seminar as a whole. Thank you again. Have a great day.